Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing very well. For today's valued viewer requested question, we've got from Chandler, subject John Boyd. Cap, I'd love to hear your thoughts on John Boyd, the creator of the F-16, F-15 partial and the A-10. He was a fighter pilot and created the theory of energy management. Would make for an amazing video. Anyway, keep up the awesome work. So the plan was that I was going to buy a book on John Boyd, I'm sure there are many, and read about this and make the video myself, but I never got around to it because a million things to do. So instead I've called on my beautiful humans. We've got Artie here and Tate, which are like moving, I don't know, memory banks basically. And we're going to talk about Mr. Boyd. First of all, I'll talk about the very little that I know about him, and then we'll start passing it over to the guys. So all I know is from what I picked up on, just average documentaries that have come on the Discovery Channel and stuff like that over the decades, in that his theories were evolved and used in the creation of a lot of fourth gen fighters, F-15, F-16, and I believe he was also directly involved in the creation of possibly two of the best planes ever made for their performance, how they performed in history. Their design philosophy is F-16 Fighting Falcon, and which is designed as a dogfighter, energy fighter, and the ground attack, loiterable, incredibly tough, redundant systems type aircraft, the A-10, the Thunderbolt, the Warthog. That's about pretty much what I know roughly regarding history. My understanding is he was trained up during World War II, but never fought in World War II per se. Fought in the Korean War, where he cut his teeth, dogfighting against MiGs and whatnot there, and that was very much a dogfight based. This is pre-reliable missiles at the end of the day, so very much dogfight based engagements. And then from there, he was presumably spotted as a talent in that he could not only fly, but he could translate the way that he flies to be able to educate and develop. That's pretty much all I know. So if I pass over first of all to Artie, where you would like to start in his history, Artie?
I mean, the thing I would pick most in his history is that he is not, whilst he flew in the Korean War, for F-86s, I believe, he was not as such an active war fighter jockey. He did a tour, but he had no air-to-air kills.
Oh, interesting.
And really, his fame comes from his role as a tutor, a trainer, and his development of the theoretical basis of dogfighting, air combat maneuvers, which was basically developed over time when he was an instructor at Nellis, beloved of the DCS terrain. Where he was instructor there for quite a few years. I can't quite remember when he started. He was problematic to some extent for the senior officers there. He was the sort of person who you either worshipped him or you hated him. He didn't necessarily do things by the book. And indeed, one of the things he particularly liked to do was push the envelope. I mean, if all these planes come with a fighter envelope that you're supposed to stick to, he would push that. He would see how far you could take it without breaking the plane. And he encouraged his students to do the same, which is not the best way of making yourself most popular. But it was while he was doing this that he over time developed his theories, because at the time basically dogfighting was really done more or less by gut feel, and also was all based upon power to weight ratios, wing loading, these sorts of numbers, whereas he actually realized that what it was really about was how you manage the element of the energy that your aeroplane has got versus how your opponent managed his energy and what that meant in terms of the capability of each aircraft. But he had lots of run-ins with the authorities, if you like, and on some occasions, the only way he really managed to stay on at Nellis was by threatening to go and be a trainer elsewhere. And the last thing that the fighter weapons school at Nellis wanted was to actually have their ace pilots coming up against pilots trained in other USAF schools that could actually beat them. So it was in their interests to keep him, even though he was fairly troublesome.
Timescales, I'm guessing in Nellis, was this late 50s, early 60s? Would that be right?
Yeah. I mean, his the main work he produced, which was his aerial attack study, which became the manual, if you like, for the USAF aerial combat, was produced around about 1961 and went sort of on general circulation in the USAF around about 1963. But technically speaking, when he produced that, he was actually associated with doing a degree course, a engineering degree course at the Georgia Institute of Technology, because as a instructor, as a fighter pilot, they were encouraged to take on additional education courses. Very few of them would have went the engineering route, but he did, because he knew that there was something important in the engineering to do with how aeroplanes performed. So he went that way. So he developed his theories to do with the importance of energy management, or rather put them on a mathematical basis to prove what he knew was actually true, whilst he was at the Georgia Institute. So that'd be 1960, I think he started there. 1961, he produced that first document. He actually produced in his career, published very little indeed. I think probably only aerial combat related, possibly only two documents. Though later on, when he left the USAF, he went on and produced general works on military strategy, which is not just to do with air warfare, but to do with armies fighting each other, historical reviews of Genghis Khan and all sorts that he did, and ultimately went on to apply a lot of these ideas to business strategy as well.
Okay. Are we talking about the creation of energy management charts here, or did they predate this era?
Technically speaking, he didn't invent them. There was another chap.
Is that Thomas Christie?
That's him. That's the chap. Yeah. And Boyd freely admitted that he borrowed some of that ideas and indeed some of the charts from him. But he recognized that what those charts were doing was describing in a chart form and mathematically what he had concluded from his actual flying experience.
I think energy management, from what I've heard, was developed quite a lot in the Vietnam War, when they realized that the F-4 Phantom couldn't outturn the Russian plane at the time. And so he had to basically, because it was all to do with turn rates at that time, in war, in that time in the military, certainly in air warfare, and he basically had to figure out some way for the F-Force to have an advantage. That's my understanding of it anyway. I may be wildly off there, but that was my general understanding.
That's absolutely right. I mean, part of the problem as he saw it was that the US Air Force was producing interceptors. It wasn't producing dogfighting planes. And so therefore they were at a definite disadvantage. And in terms of maneuverability and energy usage, the MiGs were superior, and they could outturn something like a Phantom every time. So you had to get clever. You had to fly the Phantom in a manner that exploited its strengths,
right,
avoiding the areas where the MiGs have the strengths.
Quite a lot of nicknames. So some you'll have heard were like the Mad Major and 42nd Boyd. And the reason he was called 42nd Boyd, and this is a widely bandied around story, no one's quite sure how true it is that while he was an instructor for the FWS, the Fighter Weapons School, he had a bet with anyone, I can't remember how much it was for, that from a disadvantaged position, he could get a kill shot within 40 seconds. And apparently he never had to pay out on that bet.
Yeah, he had over 90 opponents who tried to actually claim the prize. I think it was $100, which is a lot of money. And I believe he defeated 90 opponents.
Roger.
Who tried to beat him.
So at Nellis, while he's doing these practice dogfights, my understanding that the technique that he employed that was groundbreaking or different was that 90-something% of the other pilots at the time would fly like me, i.e. kind of just by gut feel, do what feels right. Whereas he would do it different. He would analyze the situation, almost kind of view it, I guess, as kind of like a tack view, look at the numbers, and then work out a kind of almost a kind of mathematical model plan and employ that. Do you want to go into that a bit, Artie, if you know anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, what he was doing that was different was realizing that what really mattered was the energy state of your aircraft compared to the energy state of your opponent. And the way to make that assessment is to really understand the energy state of your aircraft, how it performs, how the energy that you've got to apply to your maneuvering varies by your speed, by your altitude, by the G you're pulling, by your engine thrust, compared with what is happening to the other guy as well. So when he comes into a fight, the first thing he said he would always do is observe his opponent, see how he reacted, possibly feed him a maneuver just to see what he did, and from that predict what he was likely to do, what maneuvers he was likely to employ. And then, knowing the strengths of his own aircraft, he would plan the appropriate counter moves. So in fact, in his aviation aerial attack strategy document, most of that document, you won't find a single EM diagram in that. What mostly he was doing was he analyzed what we would think of as all the basic fighter maneuvers. So you've got your scissors in there, you've got your various barrel rolls, all of these standard maneuvers that we all probably use. But he in that manual was presenting what the maneuver was, how you did it, when you should use it, and if somebody used it on you, how you should counter it. And basically, so what he was doing is when he got into his jet and his opponent got into their jet, he was opening a mental book which he carried with him of what his strengths were, what his enemy's strengths were, and what maneuvers to use in what circumstances to actually get the win.
To me, it sounds like very much it's based on knowledge and understanding of these aircraft, like going to university to really understand something. And then once he's got that understanding, which maybe a lot of other pilots did or didn't have, then it allows him to make these assessments.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's what was different, because everybody else was doing, what probably your average DCS pilot would do, which is just fly by the seat of his pants, use some experience. So, the guys that his contemporaries were flying, they were fighting with success, but they didn't necessarily understand why they were doing what they were doing. They just, experience and feel suggested this was a good way to approach the problem. Whereas he basically invented the idea that if you actually do the book study and understand how your plane works, and understand, and most importantly, how your opponent's plane works, you can then plan what you're going to do. You're not just reacting and following your gut.
The big thing about John Boyd was he brought it into fruition. He brought this idea. So dogfighting with the F-86s and things like that, it was considered far too complex for a human to understand. There were far too many variables. He actually wrote it down and provided the manual, and that aerial attack study is the manual of how to dogfight, whereas before it was just considered, if you had a good instinct, then you were good.
Yeah, absolutely. That's just completely right, isn't it?
That manual, if you read it, is very much tied to its time as well, in that he is fighting, looking at the scenarios where he has got something like an AIM-9B, which was the current infrared missile at the time, and you've got guns. So you're assuming that your opponent has the equivalent. So he is looking at how you sort of initiate the fight, how you avoid getting killed by his missile, how you avoid his missile, and then how you can position yourself for the best probability of a kill on your missile shot, knowing the capabilities of the missile. And also then being able in a position whereby you know, therefore, that he's got to react to avoid that missile, predicting what he is going to do that avoiding, and getting yourself in the position where you can do the follow-up guns attack based on where he's going to be when he's finished avoiding that missile.
So the OODA loop is how he thought about things. So it's observe, orient, decide, act. So if you click on that photo, you can see what we sort of mean. So this is how he thought about things, and this is how he did that 40-second from a disadvantaged position to an advantaged position. He, instead of just sort of having a fluffy understanding or using instinct, he used this very, very specific system. And this nowadays is used in everything. This is used in litigation. This is used in law enforcement, in the military. Observe, orient, decide, act. Whether you use those words or a different version of those words is used everywhere. And it's basically, it's so that you can keep yourself updated as to the situation. So you observe the enemy has this state, you orient yourself, you know what that state means, so you know what he can do from that position, you decide on the best input, and then you act on it.
So was he teaching this at the time?
Yeah, this is what he developed. This was his thought process and how he actually went about deciding what to do in a certain situation. And the good thing is you can act and then go straight back to the beginning. So if you see a maneuver being pulled, you go through that loop, you act on that decision, and then if you see another maneuver being pulled, you go straight through the loop again.
Roger, and I see this continuous feedback loop, so it's constantly being done. It's weird, it almost kind of reminds me of like a basic computer, of how a computer works, you know, taking its inputs and it's interesting. And
that was the thing. He wanted to make it more like not like a computer, because obviously they weren't really that big at the time, but he wanted to make it. Exactly, he wanted to give you something to actually do instead of just having an instinct.
And the important thing was he put this into a form that he could teach.
Yes.
And then being able to teach it, he could demonstrate that it got the results. And that's ultimately how then this became accepted as the standard, because it delivered the results.
He was the guy that wrote the textbook, you know, he's the guy that started it all.
Okay, so what we've been talking about is how Boyd, how his mind worked, how his innovations in terms of practice and methods. Now what I want to switch to is how Boyd actually started influencing the development of aircraft. Did he have input into the F4 Phantom? Did he have input into, at which point did his ideas actually started seeing fruition in terms of aircraft design?
So once he'd done, based on Thomas Christie's work, EM theory, or energy maneuverability theory it was called, he went on to, from what I'm reading, sorry, I'm reading at the same time here, but he found the F-15 project, or the Air Force's FX project was sort of floundering. And he was brought in to redo the trade-off studies, because obviously they'd seen his work on EM and wanted him in there. He then went on to do this really, really interesting thing called, there was what's called a fighter mafia, which was him, a colonel called Everest Riccone, I've probably ruined his name there, and Pierre Spray. And basically they wanted what later became known as the lightweight fighter program. So the F-15 project, which was nicknamed Bluebird, they actually wanted to make it, instead of a 2+, 2.5+ Mach fighter, they wanted to make it a clear weather air-to-air with a top speed of 1.6, so that it was lower weight and therefore better maneuverability and lower cost. They also wanted to get rid of, quite interestingly, they wanted to get rid of an active radar and radar-guided missiles. So they wanted to basically strip everything out and just make it a lightweight, maneuverable aircraft, and obviously the Pentagon said no, but that's what based the lightweight fighter program on, which is sort of where the F-16 came from.
And the same thing in essence happened with the F-16 as well. He had a bit more success with that, but he was equally unhappy with the way the F-16 turned out, because again he was trying to influence the design to be this ideal lightweight dogfighter.
Pure breed, yeah.
And pure breed. And of course, the Pentagon wouldn't have it and started putting more and more into it. And in the end, what it was produced was a much more general purpose machine rather than the totally dedicated fighter that Boyd wanted to produce. I mean, it is still a good dogfighter, let's face it, and it's still relatively cheap as well, because that was another factor he was trying to do, was to actually produce something that wasn't stupidly expensive. And he partly succeeded with the F-16, more so perhaps than the F-15 that he succeeded with. But even though he was disappointed with what the F-16 ended up being.
I think he was he'd obviously put a lot of effort into this EM theory and a lot of effort into the aerial attack. And I think not that he was lagging behind the sort of multi-role aspect that the US Air Force wanted, but I definitely think he wanted to return to an era of dogfighting and ultra maneuverability. I think that was his real passion.
Yeah, because of course in the early days of the Vietnam War, where the F-4 first came in, the assumption was that you killed at a distance with your missiles. You certainly didn't get into guns range. They discovered their mistake there and then fitted gun pods to the F-4 in the end and flew it right, because again, F-4 in a dogfight needs to be handled in a particular way. So the concept that you had to be able to dogfight was, by the time they came to the F-15 program, coming well back into vogue. However, they still wanted that multi-role fighter.
Roger.
Because they still had those big shiny BVR missiles, and they would much rather kill the enemy with one of those than actually get into a knife fight.
One of the designers of the F-16 itself is a guy called Harry Hilacker. And he says he would have definitely designed the plane differently if he'd have known that it had become multi-mission. So they definitely designed this plane for, lightweight. It's why it's such a good dogfighter, because they wanted lots of thrust to weight ratio, great turning circles, everything like that. And it ended up being lugged on with, heavy multi-role stuff like advanced stabs and active radar, stuff like that.
So at the moment we're talking about his contribution into trying pushing the 15 and 16 programs into the direction that he wanted. But then we have a change, and apparently also involved in the Warthog project. So why was this?
Well, again, he was the man. He was the sort of the how to fight in a plane man. He was the energy management man. So he was the natural person you would go to, because an A-10 might not be designed as a dogfighter, but you want it to be maneuverable, and it's by definition going to be loaded down and heavy. So achieving acceptable or even a good maneuverability as well when you're loaded down was a real energy management problem, and he was the man.
I'm just reading from Ivan's chimed in. With Colonel Everest Riccioli, Pierce Spray, Boyd formed a small advocacy group within headquarters at USAF that dubbed itself the Fighter Mafia. Using his energy management theory, Boyd spurred the USAF to explore a lightweight fighter program. So we're going to talk about F-16 and F-18. This led to the development of the YF-16, which would become the F-16 Falcon, and the YF-17, which would become the Hornet. I've never seen his name actually attached to the Hornet, but I guess at least in the way he spurred the program on, must be some legacy.
Yeah, the important thing was he got the acceptance that these concepts were important, and they're important whatever you were designing.
Roger. And so if it wasn't for him, and maybe if he didn't exist, maybe someone else would have been in his place. But if it wasn't for what he was doing, should we say, then maybe fourth gen fighters wouldn't have turned out the way they did. And fourth gen fighters are all, they're all decent dogfighters. The F-15, big, heavy, fast, but it's actually, relatively decent dogfighter. F-16, F-18, both decent dogfighters. Maybe they would have gone the F-4 Phantom way and just got bigger and heavier and more, more heavily loaded and more based around firing long-range missiles. Any thoughts on that?
He was certainly influential in it, and he was certainly a part of the group that were really pushing for this lightweight, ultimate dogfighter design. And I think they've actually struck a really healthy balance between a good dogfighter and something like the F4 Phantom, which is just sheer power.
I just find it totally fascinating in the way that, you know, he was very much the man, yet, you know, you would tend to assume therefore he had this string of combat kills behind him, but he doesn't. It's not there. It was basically his own flying experience, a little bit of military flying experience, and then the time he had spent as an instructor with the students, working on what was the best way to succeed and applying brain power. So his value is definitely the brain power he applied.
In terms of a military strategist, there's very little that he actually published. I believe there's just a presentation and then a short essay. But I believe he was very influential in, just let me have a read, see if I can find it, Operation Desert Storm. So I believe he was very influential in the sort of, you know, the left hook design of the strategy there. And yeah, it's certainly been commented on that he was the design, or at least helped the design of that.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Nice short, or relatively short, look at his career and what he was involved in. Thank you for Artie and for Tate for doing all the work there. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you later.